Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a new webinar in my series on agility. My name is Ian Banner. We're just waiting for more people to start attending. We'll aim to start the main webinar in less than a minute. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Ian Banner from Big Agility. You're listening to the start of my new webinar, What's the Point of Story Points? It will start in about 40 seconds. Thanks for holding. Good morning if you just joined, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is What's the Point of Story Points, one of the free webinars from the Big Agility Company. My name is Ian Banner. I'm the co-founder of Big Agility. The webinar is just about to start. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, What's the Point of Story Points? My name is Ian Banner. The webinar is just about to start. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from Big Agility. There are other webinars available at the end of this short webinar, which I expect will take no more than 20 minutes. You'll get some links to other webinars that are available right now that you can get to, that are part of a backlog of webinars on the basics of agility, basics of Agile and Scrum and why they work. These are provided free by my company, bigagility.com. It's one in a series that are available. The website you go to, by the way, is www.ianbanner.com/webinars. That'll be at the end. The first recording of this was done with an invited webinar audience of about 20 people. If you weren't part of that, what you're seeing is a replay of the live event at the time that is available. I am available online to answer questions, but you should see that the questions all need to come to me via email. So on the link on the side there, you should see the chat is not open at the moment. You'll need to email me, and if I get the emails, I will respond to the emails in time. On the first recording of this, I've already received a few emails on the subject that I'll look at later. Last webinar I did, there were some mild distractions going on in the chat where other people were essentially saying things that probably I wouldn't have agreed with, and therefore I've disabled the chat for this one. We'll see if it works. Welcome along. It might be worth you now just telling me roughly where you're from in email form. As I say, if you type it in now, I get to see it within a few seconds on the email system. So we'll see that come out in the next few minutes. As I've said, this is one of a series. Not all of them are freely available all the time, but some of them will be available. And if you go to ianbanner.com/ sorry, that's not ianbanner.com. It's I don't know why I said that. It's bigagility.com. I do apologise. bigagility.com/webinars. I think I've said ianbanner.com twice. I do apologise. It's bigagility.com/webinars. And I can see the usual suspects coming in from various places. Good morning. Yes. Good morning, James. Good morning, Mutu. Good morning, David. Yes, thank you. Yes, nice to see you as well. Apparently the weather in Uganda is blisteringly hot, which is great for us in the UK, where it's mildly just a little bit warm this morning. Thank you very much for Charlene. Yes, for reasons I don't know, people are telling me about the weather. I'll leave that for the moment and get straight into my detail. So this talk is about story points, and I'm pitching it specifically at people who are quite senior in companies. And the question that I'm asked a lot is, well, why does Agile have this thing called story points? I don't understand it. And partly what happens is senior managers, in principle, sort of because they don't quite understand what's going on with story points, revert to estimating. That's usually a waterfall way of estimating. So what I want to do to start with is do some conceptual work on pointing out why story points exist. And then I'm going to answer a bunch of questions that are coming in. I might revert to a whiteboard diagram as well later to explain something. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. So let's get straight into the material. I'd like you to introduce you to my brother-in-law, who's called Dave. And I want to talk a little bit about how Dave drives. This is how Dave drives. He plans the route in advance. He prints off the Google route and follows it diligently. He avoids motorways wherever possible. He likes to drive at 53 miles an hour because he drives very efficiently with petrol. That's my brother-in-law, Dave. Meanwhile, this is how I drive. When I get into my car, I find out where I need to go once I'm in the car. I put postcodes in. I put Google Maps on my phone screen and avoid traffic delays by rerouting. I always choose the fastest route and I always drive at 77 miles per hour. So my brother-in-law Dave, he prints off the Google route and takes the print with him into the car and follows the route that Google has told him diligently, but he prints it off in advance. I just put Google Maps on my phone screen and avoid any traffic delays. And I always drive at 77 miles per hour. My brother-in-law Dave lives in Shenfield in England and I live in Sheffield in England. So how long does it take to get from Sheffield, where I live, to Shenfield, where my brother lives? How long does it take to get? And the simple answer is, it depends who you ask. There's my brother Dave. If you ask Dave, he says, I like to have 6 hours for the journey. If you ask me, I say, I've just looked it up, as I start the journey, it's 2 hours 34 minutes. Who is right? Who is right? And actually, the truth is we're both right, because how long the drive will take depends on who does the drive. And actually it depends on a load of other things as well. I'll mention that later. So that problem that me and my brother-in-law can't agree on an estimate for a piece of work, when it's very clear what the work is the reason story points exist. One of the points of Agile is that people estimate in teams to get a good estimate. But what do you do when we were doing, let's say it was journeys, let's say we worked for a transport company and Dave and I both worked for the company, we were estimating how long jobs would take. Well, we can't agree, can we? I would say it takes 2 hours and I'd be sure. Dave would say it takes 6 hours and he'd be completely sure as well. So this is where story points come in. Let's look at a few examples. According to me, Sheffield to Shenfield takes 2.575 hours. According to Dave, it takes 6 hours. And the distance, we both agree, is 175 miles. Sheffield to Newcastle, I say that takes about 2.5 hours. Newcastle, if you're not from England, is a northern town on the coast. Dave would say it takes 6 hours because it's about 160 miles. Newcastle to Shenfield, which is from the north to the south, I would take 5 hours, Dave would take 12, 230 miles an hour. You can see the problem if Dave and I are trying to estimate work together, which is where story points comes in. And the purpose of story points is just this. Things like Newcastle to Durham, things like Birmingham to Wolverhampton, things like Reading to Oxford, they're all travelling and they're all roughly the same amount of travel. They're not exactly the same, but they're roughly the same. And if we say there are 2 points to do, Sheffield to Shenfield is roughly a little bit more than twice Newcastle to Durham, so we say it's 5 points to do. Sheffield to Newcastle is 5 points. Newcastle to Shenfield is 8 points. Edinburgh to Birmingham is 13. And what we've done is we've started to group things together that are roughly equivalent in size for estimating purposes. We haven't said who's doing the work, we haven't said how long it's going to take, we haven't decided whether it's someone who knows it well or a beginner. What we're doing is we are roughly estimating how big things will take. What if we wanted to estimate London to Barcelona? Well, we'd say it's definitely bigger than Edinburgh to Birmingham. There's a few more things you've got to do, like go to the Channel Tunnel, etc. What about traffic? Well, when you're estimating well in advance, you can't possibly know what the traffic is, can you? Who is driving? What weather you will have? And the point here is, when you do the estimates very early on, you won't have any of that detail in front of you. And so your estimate is just that, it's an estimate. And for comparison purposes, you make it as big as some other things. So next time a journey comes up and I would look at this table, I would go, is it equivalent, roughly the same as Birmingham to Wolverhampton? That's a bit bigger, okay. Is it as big as Sheffield to Shenfield? No, it's a bit smaller. Okay, we'll call it a 3 then. Another piece comes in, which is, I'm picking one at random now. Let's say I was in America, New York to Alaska. Is that the same amount of journeying as Newcastle to Durham? Of course not. Is it more than Edinburgh to Birmingham? Yes, it is. So I go up from 13 to one of the higher numbers in story points. Remember, I'm not teaching the technique of using story points for sizing today. I'm talking about why you use them. What's the advantage of them? I'll do another seminar on story point technique, how you do the voting. But this is why. So can you see that with story points you can group work of a similar amount of volume? That's what story points gives you. In planning, it allows you to approximate how big work is relative to each other. It means you don't have to look at the detail too early. It means you aren't tied to a time estimate yet. As I say, most uses of story point estimating limit you to the lower end of the Fibonacci series. So it's got 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13 in. Because the goal is to group things of similar overall size rather than pursue a highly precise estimate. This is important. So sometimes I've been doing some story point work even this week where someone has said to me, it's between a 3 and a 5, can I call it a 4? And I said, no, you can't call it a 4 because calling it a 4 means you know it's definitely smaller than a 5 and you can't possibly know that now. So call it a 5. I've seen people who go, actually, I want roughly 10. Can I say 2 5s? And I go, you're missing the point. I say it more politely than that, but I say you're missing the point. The point isn't it might be 10 or 13. It's is it 8 or is it 13? And the Fibonacci sequence, you don't have to use it, but it forces you to realize you're just estimating. You're not committing yet to what it is. So in this scenario where a friend of mine says, but it's a 10, I go, it's either an 8 or a 13. Tell me what you want to put it at. And they go, but it's a 10. And I go, you can't possibly know it's really a 10 and it isn't an 8. So you might as well make it an 8. And if in the end, if people don't make a choice, I give them the lower choice. I'll say in that case, I'm assuming it's an 8. Anyway, another seminar or a webinar on how story points are used in practice. This is the theory, okay? Now, this is a key point about why story points exist, and it's this. They are helpful in giving you the ability for different team members to estimate based on them being different. Let me put that very clearly. Story points are helpful because they allow the team members to perform at different levels and speeds to communicate an estimate collaboratively, okay? You don't want everyone to perform at the same team, do you? Surely don't you want everyone to perform at the same team, I should have said. Well, the answer to that is, it depends on the type of team. Because on some teams, you do want them all to perform at the same rate. A five-a-side football team, you want them all to have ball skills, you want them all to have speed. You don't need specialisation. You don't need someone who's really good at long free kicks. You don't need someone who's really good in goal. But in an 11-a-side football team, you do want someone who's really good in goal, who specialises in that. You do want someone who knows how to run the midfield. You do want someone who can score from free kicks at 30 yards. So actually, whether you want everyone who can perform the same task at the same speed or not is down to the team and what the team has got to do. So story points help because people do estimate at different levels and do work at different levels. And you're going to ask me, well, what do you do about people who, genuinely work at different levels? Don't you need to sort that out? I'll come back to that and why that can get sorted out a little later on. But there you go. Story points are helpful because they allow team members during the estimation, during the start of the project, to perform at different speeds, to communicate and estimate collaboratively at the start without any tensions. This is a key thing. They are your first estimate, not your final commitment. I want to say that very clearly. Story points are your first estimate to how big things are, not your final commitment. They let you know how big a backlog is. They roughly let you know how long it's going to take to solve that backlog. So if the backlog is a certain number of points, you know that's probably going to take you 7 months. And that's a good thing to know early if the client has asked you to do it in 3 months. You know you've got too much work on. They are your first estimate, not your final commitment. So if I compare that to waterfall, where waterfall is you must stick to the plan and all estimates must be 100% accurate at the time they're made, in the hope that somehow that creates the idea that you've got certainty on a project. Compare that to Agile, where we estimate to understand the overall size and complexity of a piece of work at the start. Now, if you force these estimates to be fixed, you're actually losing one of the key points of Agile, which is that the efficiency improvements that come from a team increasing in performance are lost. If you force them to, well, when I 6 months ago estimated this, I thought it would probably take 3 days. And then somebody is telling them, you said 3 days, you've got to do it in 3 days. And they now understand the project and know it's 3 weeks. you're not going to get a performance improvement out of them. You're going to get the opposite of that. Okay, so the fact is, it doesn't matter what someone thought 6 months ago. That's why sprint planning exists. Sprint planning is that's when you need to get the commitment. That and the duration of that commitment is in sprint planning. Sprint planning is there to get the commitment you need at the time you need it for the duration you need it, which is in the sprint. This is really important because sometimes teams. If you've seen my talk on team efficiency and how teams improve their efficiency to get 10, 15, 20, 30 times more efficient, one of the reasons they don't get more efficient is if they are forced to believe in an estimate that was made 6 months ago. I probably need to do some more talk on how teams become more efficient. I did a talk called Hyper Performant Teams, which I think is available on an easy replay service. Look it up on the webpage, www.bigagility.com/webinars. There's a talk there on team efficiency called Hyper Performant Teams, Teams on Fire. I probably need to do another talk on how teams actually, on a large enterprise project, suddenly become more and more efficient. But one of the things that stops them is if they are being beaten up over some estimates from a while ago. So I want to say it again, story points allow you to size the general backlog. They are not your final commitment to how long it will take when you get there 4 months later. Let's move on a bit. What they do, story points, is allow you to handle very early on in the project things you can't possibly really know too well. That's the complexity, the effort and the doubt involved. So at the start of a project, there's a lot of stuff to figure out. And we know we can solve a problem and we probably have a decent feel for how we'll approach it, but we still have a lot to figure out. That's the complexity of it. And if you're trying to tell people, well, look, right now you've got to tell me if it's a week or not, then they'll go, okay, I'm going to have to say 3 weeks because I need to give myself some space and some time in case I've got it wrong. If you do story points instead, you just say, this is just about as big as that, really, isn't it? That's all we're saying today. It allows you to juggle with effort. As I've said, the time things take can vary depending on who's doing them later. Doubt. At the start of the project, there's a load of stuff you don't know. And you don't know whether you're going to get it right or not. And therefore, you can't estimate in great detail at that point. Classic ones are, let's say it's just a database that you do on a website. What web technology are you going to use? Are you going to use it using WordPress? What kind of database is it? Is it an SQL database? Is it a MongoDB database? Those are things that you probably don't know at the very start when you're trying to work out how big it is. Now, you might think if you're a waterfall expert, this is rubbish. But I want to remind you what you do in waterfall. You get someone who's done it before to stick their thumb in the air and predict 18 months in the future. Like a Mystic Meg, if you're a European or American or Australian listener, Mystic Meg is a UK character that used to predict the lottery numbers on the big national lottery just before they came out. She never actually predicted the numbers. She just said things like, people with black hair will win tonight. It was quite odd that this was a bit of a celebrity status at the time. My point is, on a waterfall project, you are doing the job of Mystic Meg. You are trying to predict the future without having enough evidence. At least on an agile project, you're predicting the future in rough terms to help you get started. Okay. So the story point advantage, final slide on this. In this, taking all these things into account, I think this thing is bigger than most of the things we call a 3 and smaller than most of the things we call an 8. So we'll call it a 5 today. That's key to how story points work. So some questions now. When does the estimate become fixed? When do I know what I'm getting? And the answer is at sprint planning. This is exactly what tasks are needed. When you do sprint planning, you say, this is the story, what tasks are needed, how long are they going to take, can we get them done, how many hours are we going to take to do them all. At sprint planning, you get the commitment for the following sprint. Okay? And I know people are now, some people are going, what? Well, this is ridiculous. I can't get a commitment until we get to sprint planning. I prefer waterfall where all the commitments are up front. My answer to that is, all the commitments pretend to be up front on waterfall, but how many waterfall projects actually last to that commitment exactly? The great thing about Agile is that you get the commitment at the time you need it, not before and not after. Okay? You take a waterfall project with your fixed estimate. Who fixed them and when are they fixed? They're fixed at the start by usually a project manager, usually someone who's got a lot of skin in the game to get it done early. Usually it hasn't been seen by any devs. Now, I'm not like an agile evangelist who just does agile and doesn't do anything else. I'm, PM trained, and I do lots of other kinds of projects. But this point, I think, is a very valid one about agility. It is designed to give you fixed commitments when you need them, not in advance. And it is designed to give you true commitments, not false commitments, not false commitments. Now, when we do agile, we estimate everything at the start, but then we do it again when we're doing sprint planning, okay? And in sprint planning, we estimate again. And here's the technique I'd suggest. When a story comes into sprint planning, don't tell the team what the original story point was. Let them work out what a new one is based on their work. What you'll find when that happens is, and I'm seeing this all the time, a story that in original terms was down as 40 points suddenly is 13 points because they're now near and they know what they're doing. And that's how the efficiency starts to come, okay? Now, what if the estimate goes up? Let's say originally it was 20 points, it comes in, sprint planning, they make it 40 points. Well, the answer is, it was always 40 points, you now know it clearly, okay? That's the main point. Because just because an estimate was 20 points 4 months ago doesn't mean the work was any different, really. It's just we now understand it. And in fact, knowing that something you've got to do is much bigger than you anticipated, as soon as you get to it, is actually a plus, not a minus. What's the alternative on waterfall? You extend your design by 3 weeks and nobody really knows why, because the work was bigger than it was. Anyway, so when does an estimate become fixed? It becomes fixed during the sprint planning. That's when the estimate becomes fixed. Can I convert story points to days is another question I got asked. This is a really interesting one, because if you've done all the theory of what story points are now, you'll know that if you convert to days too early, what will happen is people will argue over how many days it takes and they become all fixed and you lose the whole point of story points. However, on enterprise-wide teams, where you've got several teams, you do need to have some kind of benchmark. Because what I've seen happen is one team in a company, a certain amount of work is 2 points. In a different team, that same amount of work is 1 point. And if there's no benchmark between the teams, different teams working on the same sort of areas, there's no benchmark. One team will look twice as performant as the other when it isn't really. So there is a point to looking at days as well. And here's what I do. So I've worked at a company where an entire new backlog needs to be sized, one of 3 areas. And what we said is, roughly, we're finding that a dev's day is roughly 2.5 points on the other teams. So let's use that as our benchmark as we look at this work, because there's no point us having completely different point counts in different teams in the same project. So that's when I would look at just a rough understanding of story points to days, but that does not mean it's a commitment to effort yet when it's done, okay? And then the next point when I convert story points to days is when I actually move them into the sprint. When I do sprint planning, that's when they turn into days, or more usually hours, because the work we do in tasks is broken down into less than a day, so it's usually hours. Sometimes it's minutes, but normally I ask people to estimate the tasks in hours. Now, if you've gone through all this, you've got a few other questions in your mind. I'll be quick with these. What about Dave and how long he takes to do things? You remember my brother-in-law Dave at the start, who takes way too long to drive? What do you do about Dave and how long he takes compared to me and how long I drive? If you're a company that shifts loads and loads of driving around all the time, Dave is going to be very inefficient. And the answer to that is yes, he is. And part of Scrum will bring that inefficiency out, and the team will work out what to do. Sometimes, if I'm being honest with you, Dave will leave in this scenario. Sometimes he'll go and do other jobs that he can do. Maybe Dave is brilliant at packaging or organising. And sometimes it gets to the point where, because it's obvious to everyone, Dave is incredibly underperforming compared to everyone else, that Dave is asked to move on. That does happen, but that's part of life. And the thing I'd say about Agile is this: it exposes that in a way waterfall doesn't. So it's always very difficult on a waterfall project for people to work out who is performant and who isn't performant. On an Agile project, it's much easier, but it's not just much easier for the management, it's easy for anybody on the team to see, because Dave is not getting stuff done, and Ian is, in my scenario. Okay, so let's go to some other common questions quickly on this subject. Um, Here's some questions that come in. What if I'm the only one working on a task? In that case, your estimate is the king estimate. If you're the only one who's ever going to do it, your estimate matters more than anyone else's, and you need to show everyone what the estimate is and how you come up with it, and it's the best they'll get right now. And certainly, sometimes you see teams estimating where there's only one person who really knows what that is, and a good Scrum Master allows that to happen and says, okay, you know, PJ is saying it's 5 points, everyone else is saying it's 1, but PJ, you really know what you're talking about. I think we're going to go with the 5 points. You also have to watch the same thing happening where there's always somebody who always estimates lower than everyone else. That always happens when you do team estimating. Someone who thinks everything is easy and therefore gives everything 2 points when everyone else gives it 8. And again, you just call that out as a Scrum Master. You go, okay, it looks like yet again Cyril is estimating lower than everyone else. Next question. What if I have a little bit to do on someone else's work? Okay, so there's a big piece of stuff doing, you've only got a little bit to do. You need to make sure that your estimate is included in the overall story estimate, your bit of work. That is essentially, if you're working on a team, you go, has anyone forgotten that we've got to do some testing on this as well? Oh, you're testing, okay, that's probably going to add a couple of points to the story, isn't it? What if everyone on the team has to do the same thing? Okay, that's a bit weird. Let me just see what that really said. Okay, yeah, okay. So the example is everybody in the team has got to spend a day writing objectives. How many points do you put down? Well, that you sum up the whole team doing it. So let's say you're in a company where a point was a day. That's a terrible thing for me to say, but you'll get the point in a minute. One story point is a day, and the team is 5 people, and every one of you has got to spend a day writing your objectives for the following year as a HR exercise. Then you will put the story as 5 points because it's how long the whole team take to do it, not the individuals. What if the story is too big to do in one sprint? Actually, when you're doing story estimating and the backlog estimating, that's okay. The issue is not how long it takes to deliver. The issue is how big it is. When you actually get to the sprint planning, though, by then the product owner and Scrum Master should have broken it down into stuff that can be delivered within a sprint. You always have to do work that can be delivered within the sprint. Here we go. What if there are too many unknowns? Well, then my suggestion is you write as many assumptions as you need before voting, and as long as everyone agrees what those assumptions are, and you make those assumptions noted in the story so that when it's looked at later, you know what the stories were. Well, that's all you do. You just make as many assumptions as you need to get to the point where you can vote. Okay. Our next question is a really interesting one, which is, tell me more about that team efficiency. Okay, so I'm going to the whiteboard to do that. Here we go. Sorry about that. Here we go. You should know that what happens on a project generally is that over a series of sprints, let's say sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3, sprint 4, what the original estimate for, these are story points up here, maybe that's 20 story points, that's 10, that's 0. In sprint 1, an estimate will come in at maybe 20 story points to do work. You think that's how long it'll take. What you actually deliver in that sprint might be actually no points, because when teams get together to start with, they're usually terrible. In sprint 2, your estimate starts to come much lower because you've worked out you're actually not doing much, but actually you start delivering a bit more. In sprint 3, your estimate improves and your actual delivery improves. Sprint 4, your estimate and your actual are the same. These are fairly commonly understood curves. Your actual curve looks like that, and your estimate tends to look like that. At some point, these start to be the same. And in agile terms, that point is called stable velocity. So in this story, this team probably gets a stable velocity of 10 points. Just an example. I'll put those diagrams in again because they've gone missing. There's the actual, there's the estimate. That's quite common. Now, actually, but what happens on a team is this. Let me rub this out, because what actually happens is, as the team carry on, they might be predictably getting to, in this case, 10 story points. But provided you do the right things, they'll actually slowly improve and become more and more efficient anyway. They won't realise this to start with, but when at sprint 4 they're putting 10 points in, and sprint 20 they're actually able to do 25 points per sprint. They've got more efficient, they understand what they're doing. So the point of all that was you use story points to start with, so that that efficiency drive that happens over time happens naturally and isn't, as it were, forced by a management view of waterfall for how much you can get done. The team becomes naturally efficient over time. Okay, I think that's the end of the whiteboard. Let's go back. Any other questions coming? Okay, just checking. Now, I think that's it for the questions. So we have spent a little bit more time than I'd thought, so I think we'll probably leave it there. This webinar was called What's the Point of Story Points? For a full list of available free webinars, please go to www.bigagility.com/webinars. A few other things. If you email me a list of 3 other people you know who you think will benefit from these webinars, then I will send you a free gift of a PDF of a section of my new upcoming book called Agile for Chief Execs. That also includes an electronic version of something called my Scrum Buddy book, which is available on the Kindle to get, but you will get a free electronic version. Also, if you forward the email that you used to register to anyone you think would benefit from this free training, then again, I will send you some free goodies, and that is a section of the book, and also the Scrum Buddy book, and a cheat sheet of terms to do with Scrum as well. I'll send that as well. So let me just rephrase that again to make sure. If you email me with 3 other friends who you think we should invite, or you forward the email that you used to get your registration to someone else so they can register for the next webinar, both of those will get you some free goodies from me. That's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. Look out for the next webinar, which typically happen most Fridays.